Watching Man of Steel, it occurred to me that I was seeing the character of Superman come full circle. And not in a good way, unfortunately. Superman is the original superhero. Without Superman, none of the other comic book superheroes that have now, many of them have become huge, big budget film stars themselves, none of those characters would exist without Superman. He was the originator. With Man of Steel, we have a Superman film, a movie about the original superhero that is anything but original. It feels put together, assembled from pieces borrowed from other superhero movies. Films made about those later superheroes that would not exist were it not for Superman. And there's something kind of sad about that. Much of this movie, which is very well made technically and is generally well acted, much of it is borrowed or feels borrowed from movies like Batman Begins. And that one alone kind of makes sense because David Goyer is the screenwriter of this one, as he was with Batman Begins. And by the way, screenplay by David Goyer is never a credit I have ever looked forward to seeing. I think he's a horribly overrated writer. I just don't think he's a very good screenwriter at all. And of course produced by Christopher Nolan, who was the director behind the Dark Knight trilogy. So you can understand it may be feeling a little bit like Batman Begins or playing a little bit like Batman Begins because it's by the same people who created that. But it also has elements from the Spider-Man films. It has elements very, very much so, very obviously from the Avengers. There's a graveside scene with Clark and his mother that feels lifted right out of Spider-Man. And Spider-Man 2 as well. There are graveside scenes in both of the first two Sam Raimi Spider-Man films at Uncle Ben's grave. And there's a scene in Man of Steel that feels like just taken right out of that, where they're talking about how Clark's father knew the great hero, knew what kind of a man he was going to grow up to be. Just like Aunt May telling Peter Parker in Spider-Man, he never doubted the man you'd become. A very familiar ring to it. There's Batman Begins is in there, as I said, with the sort of the pre-Superman adulthood of Clark that we get a glimpse of. And also a bit of Logan, Wolverine from the first X-Men movie. Of course, it put me in mind a little bit of the Incredible Hulk, too, the TV series, the Bill Bixby show. There's a shot of Clark with like a duffel bag over his shoulder and trying to hitch a ride on a lonely road. And of course, the first thought that I had was, he's the Incredible Hulk. He's just like the Incredible Hulk. So a lot of it feels borrowed. A lot of it feels familiar and not familiar in a reassuring, nostalgic, like, oh, look at that kind of way. Familiar in more of a, oh, I know where they got that from kind of way, in an uninspired and uninspiring kind of way. And the biggest film that it seems to borrow from, especially in the last act, is The Avengers, where the movie just completely gives itself over to being a video game. And unfortunately, the elements that it borrows from The Avengers aren't any of the elements that made The Avengers very good. I mean, the wit of the Avengers, the interplay between characters, the wonderful sense of humor, the wonderful sense of timing, and the skillful juxtaposition of comedy and drama and action. None of that is here in Man of Steel. That's completely absent. What is here from the Avengers is the mindless, just wall-to-wall, loud action sequences where it's just Superman smashing various alien creatures into buildings, the buildings crumbling or exploding, them coming back and fighting Superman. They're just action sequences that are just literally two superpowered people taking turns smashing each other into stuff, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's usually shot in kind of a shaky cam, sort of a faux handheld style, and with really quick edits and quick angle changes. And I never felt like I was lost. I never felt like I couldn't follow it, but it was just really fast and really distracting. So I guess if you're one of the mouth-breathing assholes who had a problem with Superman Returns because he didn't hit stuff enough, he didn't hit anybody in the movie, then I guess you'll really, really love these parts of Man of Steel, where it's basically just Superman getting wailed on and wailing back. So, that's for you. That's your fan service. You don't get story. You don't get character development. You get two imaginary people smashing into each other and breaking all kinds of shit all around them and causing destruction both in Smallville and in Metropolis that, if this were the real world, would dwarf the destruction of 9/11. I mean, Metropolis at the end of Man of Steel, at least the several blocks of Metropolis that we see where this battle took place, looks like Dresden. I mean, it looks like a bombed out city during a major war. It looks utterly destroyed. And of course, this is a PG-13 action movie, so none of the actions have any consequences. There's never a whisper about casualties, about how many people surely must have been killed when these entire buildings, these skyscrapers, fall and crumble to dust. I mean, thousands and thousands of people must have been killed. But there's no mention of that. And the Avengers had the same problem. The Avengers had New York City being completely wrecked by these giant aliens. But again, the Avengers had things to distract you from that. I mean, yeah, that was idiotic, but the Avengers was funny. The Avengers was clever. It was engaging. It was fun to watch. And Man of Steel just isn't. It just doesn't have any of those elements. And that sameness isn't just in the visual style and the editing style and the way the movie is shot and presented. It also goes to the story. Obviously, there's familiarity in the story because it retells Superman's origin story, but like those Earth 1 comic books that DC Comics has been publishing the last few years that are doing like more modern retellings of their famous heroes, sort of like their version of Marvel's Ultimate Universe. They're retelling familiar stories, they're retelling the origins, etc., but you can tell that they're really self-conscious about how familiar the stories are. So they change things in the story to make them different. They take the familiar story and then they try their damnedest to make it feel unfamiliar. But of course they can't change the underlying story because it is what it is and it has to go a certain place to arrive at this familiar character. So they change all sorts of details. They add things that they don't need to add. They talk about things that don't matter, that are completely irrelevant, just to make it feel like it's something other than what it is. Man of Steel has that syndrome in a big way, especially with the stuff related to Jor-El and Zod and the fate of Krypton and the culture of Krypton. The Krypton stuff, which is the first act, is tedious. I mean, it's obvious that a lot of work went into it, and it's just a wall-to-wall CGI. It's a lot like a Lord of the Rings movie, actually. There's another film that you can add to the list of movies that this movie borrows from, very obviously. Krypton looks like fucking Middle Earth mixed with like a Star Wars prequel. There's CGI animals flying around and walking around, and the costumes are all very elaborate and ornate and look like armor. And I mean, it's well acted. Russell Crowe is a terrific actor. He does very well as Jor-El. He plays Jor-El with a great sense of conviction and a great sense of sort of having a strong emotional core to the character. You know, when he addresses Zod, or when he's talking to his wife, or later in the film when he's talking to Superman, I mean, you can tell like he's really putting a lot of emotion and a lot of sincerity into his performance, and he does a good job. Michael Shannon obviously is great as Zod. He has a wonderful intensity as an actor, a wonderful ferocity, and he does fine with this version of Zod. There are some good parts. There are scenes in it that I really like. Most of the stuff with young Clark and his father, played by Kevin Costner, is really good. Made me wish that was the movie, that's what the movie was about. I mean, that's one of the frustrating things about movies like this, and also like Batman Begins, was you get these flashbacks, these little snippets that as isolated scenes unto themselves are really good, are really interesting and really warm and moving, and you know, the father-son stuff between Clark and Jonathan is just really, really, really good. And then you go back to the present day where it's all, you know, Superman smashing into stuff, and it just doesn't link up like I think the filmmakers would like it to. And I find myself wishing we could just go back and hang out with young Clark and Jonathan Smart. I mean, I feel like that's the real emotionally powerful stuff. The acting, as I mentioned before with Russell Crowe and Michael Shannon, they're terrific. Henry Cavill is just terrific as Superman. I wish he had more interesting things to do. I wish he was playing a more interesting character, but he does fine. He certainly looks the part. Great chiseled features, great physique, has a wonderful sort of easygoing, quiet personality that he plays Superman with. He's not flashy, he's not really commanding. He's just sort of humble and modest, but firm when he needs to be. And I mean, it's really well done. Good performance with lackluster material, I thought. Amy Adams is fine as Lois Lane. Amy Adams is good at almost everything, and she's very good here. Her version of Lois in this film isn't all that interesting. You feel like Lois's role for most of this film could have been filled by any other character. There's nothing really about her being there that necessitates that she be Lois Lane, other than this is a Superman movie and Lois Lane is one of the supporting characters that people expect to see. So here's Lois, and here's something for Lois to do. Lawrence Fishburne is here as well, a really great, reliable veteran actor. He plays Perry White, the editor of the Daily Planet. Does just fine, does well with the few scenes that he's given to play. He's barely in the movie. Overall, this could have been a really great movie. The idea behind this movie, and I'm talking about the sort of the central, what would be the basic premise of this take on Superman. Not necessarily the plot details, not necessarily the stupid, boring stuff about, Zod's plan to turn Earth into another Krypton, and the Codex and the crashed Kryptonian ship, and all the sci-fi stuff that is like the least interesting part of Superman to me personally. Is like the outer space. I find that tedious most of the time, and this movie did not persuade me that part of the character is more interesting than I ever thought it was. And again, it feels borrowed. Just feels like it's taken from other things. It feels like it's taken from Prometheus. But it could have been a good movie. There are certain things that this movie does, like it sort of alters the relationship between Clark Kent and Lois in a way that really departs from the traditional comic book canon. I thought that was fine. I don't mind that. I don't mind departures from canon at all if it results in something good. The idea of showing Clark sort of finding himself, the Logan bits, that I kind of disparaged. I mean, it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea to show Clark Kent wandering the earth, trying to figure out who he is. That's all good stuff. That all could have been the seed of a really great Superman movie, but it just isn't. Man of Steel just isn't that movie. And it commits another cardinal sin, which was really sad to see, because it's the first movie in a while that has really done this. The first superhero movie that has made this mistake. And that is, it's a Superman movie that isn't about Superman, ultimately. The central conflict in the movie is between Jor-El and Zod. And you never get a chance to see that conflict transferred from Jor-El to Kal-El, to Superman, because Jor-El doesn't ever really go away. Like, he's in this movie from beginning to end. Even when Krypton explodes, Jor-El is still there running around doing stuff. And so you always feel like the conflict is between Jor-El and Zod. And it's only sort of between Superman and Zod by proxy. And so it doesn't feel like Superman is really at the center of his own movie. It doesn't feel like he's really the hero. It doesn't feel like he's really the one making the decisions or facing the choices that drive the story. He's a very reactionary character. He's always flying off and saving people, and he's doing good deeds. He's acting as Superman, but he's not the engine that drives the story. And that's a big mistake. Of course, ultimately things come to blows between Superman and Zod. They have their required climactic hero versus villain big blow-up fight in Metropolis. And I mean, it really feels like a scene from a video game. I mean, even to the point where, like, they fight for a while, and then Zod kind of rises up and takes his armor off, and it's like they move to a different stage of the fight. It's like Zod is the final boss in the game, and it's that trick that they play in video games where, like, you beat the boss and it looks like you've won the game, and then he repowers and rises up and you have to fight him again. That's what it really, really feels like. And it ultimately comes down to this choice that Superman has to make between, killing General Zod to save a family that Zod is trying to kill with his heat vision, or not killing Zod and letting the family be killed by Zod. And there's supposed to be tension there. It's supposed to be like this wrenching choice that Superman has to make between taking a life of one of his people or allowing, this this crazy person to kill these innocent people. But the problem is, as I said before, there's been so much destruction up to this point. I mean, the movie really outruns itself in terms of how much chaos and destruction is caused in the fight between Superman and the Kryptonians led by Zod. That by the time we get to this point where Zod is threatening to kill these humans with his heat vision, and it's supposed to be this horrible, wrenching moment for Superman where he's like faced with the taking of these lives. And yes, I suppose it would be very emotional to have to face the prospect of seeing them like murdered before your eyes. But really, the entire city has been wrecked at this point. Like I said, there must be thousands of people that are dead as a result of this fight. I mean, does it really make that much more of a difference if Zod kills one more family? And I also had the thought in watching all of that carnage when Superman and the Kryptonians, and particularly Zod, are fighting each other and punching each other back and forth, and the city is just being destroyed all around them. I had the thought when I was sitting in the theater, boy, it's a good thing Superman was there. I mean, yes, he beats the bad guys. He destroys the villains at the end. Spoiler alert, Superman wins. But my God, the whole town is wrecked. The whole city is destroyed. Or at least a huge chunk of it, like blocks and blocks and blocks of Metropolis are just ruined. Good thing Superman was there to save the day. It's not a bad movie. It's not the worst Superman movie I've ever seen. That would probably still be either Superman 3 or Superman 4. But it is not anywhere near as good as Superman the movie or Superman 2, or indeed even in the same class as Superman Returns. Still my all-time favorite. Obviously, a lot of effort went into it on a technical level, but it's not as good as the best previous Superman movies. And unfortunately, it's also not as good as the movies that it borrows from. It's not as good as the Nolan Batman movies. It's not as good as the Raimi Spider-Man movies. It's not as good as the Avengers. It borrows from these movies, but it fails to live up to what those movies that it draws its inspiration from. A mediocre Superman movie, very disappointing. Not terrible, but very disappointing.